As a former the first deputy foreign minister of Czech Republic, how would you evaluate the current Sino-Czech relationship? Towards what direction it is moving?
Thank you for this question. First of all, I would like to underline that I am now an independent intellectual, so I'm nobody's spokesperson. I speak just on my own behalf.
Sure.
If you ask me about the current state of the Sino-Czech relations, I would say it's very much below the potential. The potential is much greater than what we have today, because our relations were first damaged by the COVID pandemics, as everyone's relations. But now when we see that the relations between the countries rebound, we actually see quite significant ideological obstacles on the Czech side. Because the Czech government which we have now in Prague, unlike the previous government, is the government which sees the things in a very ideological way and does not believe that you can have a robust cooperative relation between the countries with different political systems. And when they started their mission, they are actually claimed that they would downgrade the relations with China, and that's what they are doing.
You mentioned actually there was some obstacle. There was some obstacle between the bilateral relations, especially in the human rights issue. And you mentioned openly that you were against this human rights-oriented bilateral relations development. So if you can give some advice to the current government from your experience?
Well, I mean, what I say quite openly in the Czech public is that we should not actually impose our own concept of human rights on other countries. Of course, each country actually cares about human rights in its own way, according to its own conditions. And I think a reasonable dialogue between countries is based on the recognition of this. So my advice is, let's focus on the areas of which are mutually beneficial to our countries, and let's actually tone down the criticism of internal affairs. This should not be part of the diplomacy.
Great. The so-called China Club or China CEEC cooperation was described by your foreign minister most recently as no stance and no future during his meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Blinken. And he said that the Czech government was considering leaving the club even. What, in your opinion, prompted this statement? What are its implications on the club's development and on Czech's relationship with China and the West?
Well, as I said at the start, the current government does not believe much in cooperating with countries which have different political systems. So this statement is a result of the atmosphere which is now in Prague. However, I would like to stress that this statement is probably too extreme, even for most members of the Prague government. Even though this is the statement of the foreign minister, I would like to say that he's actually known for making all kinds of, I would say, irresponsible statements, not only about China, but also about Russia and other countries. So on the one hand, it's quite serious because these are the words of the foreign minister. On the other hand, these words should not be taken too seriously. I believe that the government, because there are voices in the government which understand that the relationship with China is actually too important to be given up because of some ideological whims. It seems to me that also the fact that the statement was made during or after the meeting with the American Secretary of State also suggests that the Czech foreign minister wanted to please his American host, which I think is an unfortunate way of doing diplomacy.
So what will be the future of this? Is this just a political gesture, or will it really result in some damage?
I would not expect Czechia to withdraw from this format. That's what I would not expect, even though you can never rule anything out in international politics. However, when we speak about the outlook, it seems to me that under the current government, we cannot expect any major breakthrough. But in less than 2 years' time, there will be elections. And it's likely that many of the parties which are now in the government will be out, and that will be the opportunity to rethink the relations with China.
Let's talk about the EU's approach towards China too. It seems to me that EU not necessarily dividing between West and East, but has contradictory approaches dealing with China, de-risking and positioning China as systematic rival on one hand, but also promoting trade and economic cooperation on the other hand. So can these two approaches coexist? Or will Europe have a coherent strategy at the end of the day?
Well, I believe that these two approaches can actually coexist, because it seems to me that they can coexist, because de-risking means that in some areas Europe became too vulnerable on other countries. It's not just about China, it's also about India, it's about Middle East, it can be also about the United States. We became too vulnerable. What does it mean? That the production of some important goods, which we need daily, is actually part of the global chains, global supply chains. And these supply chains can be actually damaged. We saw it during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, when because of lockdowns in China or lockdowns elsewhere, we actually had to face up the shortage of some very important goods like medicaments. So the lessons which we take from this in Europe is that we need to be more resilient, and in some areas we have to be more self-sufficient. So in this respect, we do actually the same thing as China, because Chinese leaders are also quite aware that in some area there needs to be a almost self-sufficiency. So Europeans will do the same, but it does not mean that they would like to break their trade relations with China, not at all. These economic relations, trade and investments relations are actually very important, and I believe that they will be further developed. I mean, if you look at people in France or in Germany, they are fully aware of the significance. On the other hand, it's not necessary to hide that there is American pressure on some countries to do less with China, and some countries actually follow this line. If they have no economic interest, they can do it. But it's pity if they actually give up on economic interests because of the desires of their Atlantic ally.
So are you suggesting that this is more like a coherent strategy already down the road, when on one hand they are de-risking not only with China, but just to be self-sufficient and self-resilient, but on the other hand still continue promoting?
Yeah, I think you can do both actually, because you simply identify the areas which where you actually see that they are actually economic areas, but also national security areas. And in those areas, you are more careful about trade and about openness. You screen the investors much better than before. So I mean, this approach of the liberal globalization, meaning openness to everyone and everything, that's over. That's over. But you know, in China, this has never been the case. Actually, China was always very careful in screening who comes in, with whom the country cooperates. So in this respect, I think we adopt the strategy, which in some respects it's similar to what China has been doing all the time.
Actually, de-risking is a different usage by EU leader, rather than the decoupling. So, in your opinion, de-risking is more like a neutral one, so that everybody can follow?
For me, it's like a technical issue. You know, it's not ideological issue. You simply actually identify the area where you see that national security is at stake, and you try to minimize risk there. Decoupling is more ideological, because it means that you really do not want to develop the relations. I don't see this actually too much. I mean, in Europe, of course, there are some Baltic countries which go this way, but no major European economy can do this actually.
It also shows some of the independence for Europe to release some of the pressure from the United States.
You know, it's actually quite interesting, because, you know, Europe has been following the United States quite closely in the last year on Ukraine. There is a very sort of, I would say that Europe actually gave up on any autonomic, independent position with Russia. But I don't think that Europe can do it on China as well. That would be simply too much. Because, you know, Europe actually gave up its economic interest with Russia, it cannot give up its economic interest with China as well.
Yeah.
That would be simply too much for Europe.
Yeah, that would be a suicide for
That
Europe.
would be
I would
economic
say.
suicide. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So, and this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative. While BRI is gaining some momentum in African countries, in Latin American countries, it met some bumps and ups and downs in Europe. So what do you see of the prospect of BRI and Europe and all BRI in Europe?
Yeah, well, as I said, that will be actually in line what we have just discussed. You know, there will be definitely cooperation in many areas and even in new areas, but there will be more of screening and more of political reflection. We have to realize that, you know, China position changed significantly in the past decade. I mean, 20 years ago, it was still considered a developing country. Today, it's a major country, the most powerful economy in the world, according to the purchasing power parity. So the approach to China will be actually on more equal footing. You know, when Europe started with China, it was rather hierarchical. It was a rich Europeans actually helping China. It's no longer the case.
Yes.
You know, we are on the equal footing, so it means that the things which Europeans did not pay attention to, they will have to pay more attention to them. It also means, you know, that China will of course, or is quite right to ask to be recognized as a great power or major power.
Yeah.
This is the case, but being major power also brings a lot of responsibilities.
When I was in Poland, I hosted a seminar between Chinese delegates and the Polish delegates on the discussion about BRI and about the cooperation in the future. So they mentioned very frankly that Poland did not gain a lot of momentum from the BRI cooperation because of some political factors, interference. So I would like to seek your opinion regarding what kind of suggestions you would have towards the BRI and the Europe cooperation. They mentioned one particular aspects regarding maybe it's not about infrastructure because you also have very good infrastructure conditions. So it's more about the soft cooperation, like the more people to people exchange, more cultural mutual understanding, as well as some other soft power development. What do you think?
Well, it seems to me, of course, that the cultural area of cultural cooperation is very important because by people-to-people contact, we deepen the mutual understanding and we can actually overcome some prejudices, which are quite widespread on both sides. However, speaking about the economic matters, what is a long-term problem between Europe and China is, of course, the access to the Chinese market. Because I mean, European market is relatively open, and there are clear rules and clear administration.
Yes.
With China, it's much more difficult for outsiders, and that's why actually many Europeans actually do complain with some justification that the benefits from the mutual cooperation are rather asymmetrical, which means that of course Europeans gain benefits, but Chinese gain much more. So, I mean, the real challenge is to make these benefits of cooperation more symmetrical by easing the access to the Chinese market and also to the Chinese economy. That will be an important challenge for future.
But there was this number comparison regarding Chinese enterprises in Europe. When China has over 2,000 enterprises in Germany, for example, there is only about 80 enterprises in Poland. Maybe there are some similar numbers in Czech as well. So this probably means that the access should be mutual as well.
Yeah, but you know, this was not the problem on the Czech side because our President Zeman, who was I would say, one of the great friends of China in Central Europe, stressed very much that he would like to welcome more Chinese investment. The simple thing is that there might not have been too many investment opportunities for China, because China is actually quite selective when investing in Europe, because Chinese investments in Europe go usually after high technologies.
Yes.
It's not like Chinese investment in Africa or Asia, which go after resources. So obviously, I mean, Germany is full of high technologies. So and that makes it interesting target for Chinese investment. Where Central European countries are less equipped with high technologies, that's why they have been less interesting for Chinese investors. So it seems to me that the dynamics is explained by this rather than by any political obstacles.
You wrote an article in which you argued that NATO membership would not give Sweden and Finland lasting security, and consequently, it will significantly harm the relationship with Russia. Can you elaborate a little bit more to our readers why you think this?
I mean, the NATO accession of Finland and perhaps also of Sweden, which is still under discussion, will make the Baltic area much more militarized, the area of the Baltic Sea.
Yes.
Because it used to be agreed that this area, until now, or until the war on Ukraine, the Baltic Sea area was lightly militarized. Given the fact that the Finland gives up its neutrality, and there will be probably NATO troops in Finland, close to Russia border, we can expect that Russia will make similar moves, actually getting closer to the Finnish border. So in this perspective, if you have a high concentration of military capabilities in a given area, that hardly actually improves the security, because it actually enhances the risk of an incident, and it's something which makes the situation less stable. So in this respect, even though I could understand why that some Finns were scared, because they had the war close to their borders, it was not really the correct response to this threat, because it's in international politics we often talk about security dilemma. You do things which are supposed to improve your security, but these things actually provoke the reaction of the adversary. So at the end of the day, the security is actually damaged rather than improved. So for me, the Finnish accession to the NATO is a textbook example of the security dilemma. Finland wanted to be more secure, but by provoking militarization, it will be less secure.
Yeah, security dilemma. So if it were you, how would you give Finland and Sweden? They do have this kind of, tensions and anxiety regarding in the wake of the war. So what kind of advice, if not?
Well, I mean, there are many people in Finland and Sweden who understand the situation, so they don't need that much advice from someone from outside. But I would just point to their history, because I mean, Finland was actually had the model of neutrality, which guaranteed its sovereignty, its peaceful development, and a reasonable level of welfare since the 1950s until the 1990s, at the height of the Cold War. So why not to stick to this? Why try to revise this right now? Because I would just tell them, take lessons from your own history. The models which you followed so far were successful. Why do you give them up?
It's already in. I mean, for Finland, will it be better off if they, reduce the military arrangement along the border, even it is already a NATO member? Is it a choice?
The very fact that they acceded to NATO, that they joined NATO, is something which will make a problem, will actually escalate the security dilemma. Of course, any other step which will increase the military presence in the Baltic area will contribute to that. So, of course, the less they do it, the better.
Yes.
But the damage was done to some respect.
Yes. So maybe the long-term solution would be everybody is talking and helping with the end of this war.
Of course, I mean, that's a huge challenge for all of us, how to end this war.
Yeah, how? So in your opinion, what will be the end game of this war? And will Putin use nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, the end game is now difficult to foresee. Well, there are many things which are difficult to foresee in this war. Recently, we experienced this adventure of Wagner Group, so that was also not obviously foreseeable that they will try to overthrow the Minister of Defense.
Yes.
But it seems to me that right now, unfortunately, the war is not in the stage where it could be ended, because Russia is actually willing to fight. Ukrainians are ready to fight, and most important of all, Americans are actually interested in continuing this war, because it's quite obvious that without the American involvement, the war could be ended quite easily. If you ask about the use of nuclear weapons, I don't believe it's real, because it's. Russia is quite clear about the conditions, and there is an official doctrine. And they say, if our national territory is attacked, if our existence is under threat, existence of Russia, I don't see this coming.
Right.
So in this respect, at least this is not as a risky option, even though, as I said, nothing can be ruled out today.
Why the United States, not willing to end this war currently?
I'm not sure. There are definitely some people in Washington, and I don't say that all the Washington. There are some people in Washington which can be quite happy with the situation. It seems to me that people in Washington are divided on this.
Yes, what goals are these people achieving?
Because the goal is actually they keep Russia busy. That's something which keeps Russia busy, which makes Russia weaker, definitely. I mean, Russia has huge costs. And the costs to Russia are bigger than the costs to United States. Of course, the highest costs are the cost of Ukrainians. That's the tragedy, because it's about Ukrainian lives. But from the geopolitical perspective, Russia will not be stronger because of this war. Russia will be weaker.
Of course.
And maybe that's something which is not so contrary to the interest of some people in Washington.
Yeah, keep Russia busy or to keep Russia weaker is definitely one goal. But in return, it will also make yourself busy and probably weaker after the war. So how do you see this kind of dilemma?
I mean, these things have always unintentional consequences. Like the Russia war on Ukraine had an unintentional consequence that Finland joined the NATO. That was not in Russian interest. Russia started the war, and then immediately Finland goes to the NATO. So that's unintentional consequence for Russia. Of course, this war will have unintentional consequences for United States as well. I mean, and I don't mean that much the budgetary consequences, because these are foreseeable. You can see them, you can count them.
Yes.
But it seems to me that one of the most serious consequences will be about the status of the dollar as an international currency, because United States used dollar as a geopolitical weapon against Russia, confiscating actually dollar assets of the Russian central bank.
Yes.
That means that actually other major countries, important economies, again will take lessons on this. And they are aware that if they have a policy which is different from Washington interest, they should not have too much of dollar assets, which means that the dollar will be much less popular as an international currency. And that will have serious implications for American economy. So that's one of the, I would say, unforeseen consequences. So another consequence, which perhaps is unforeseen but was foreseeable, is the partnership between Russia and China. This partnership is, by way, not so natural, because there are many problems between these countries. But by actually pushing the situation, United States actually made these two countries much closer than they would have ever been. So again, a consequence which I think does not correspond to American interest.
Europe, which will also be weakened.
I mean, Europe will weaken seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, the most costs are, of course, with the poor Ukrainians, because the country is likely to be completely destroyed. And that's very sad and tragic. Of course, Europe will actually carry many of the costs, because it's already today that Europe hosts like half of the Ukrainian migrants. The other half is in Russia. So And then Europe, of course, contributes to the Ukrainian war efforts. It's one of a significant part of the Ukrainian budget comes from Europe, not to speak about munition, etc., etc.
Yes.
And then, once the ceasefire eventually comes, the country will have to be rebuilt. And American will say that's European business. So again, Europe is not interested in having a completely destroyed country at its neighborhood. So they will have to again spend some money, the money which is quite rare now in Europe.
Right. So there are some proposals, peace proposals here and there, some African model or Chinese model. So how do you see the Chinese model, Chinese peace proposal?
It seems to me that China made an important gesture showing that it's committed to a peaceful solution.
Yes.
But as I said, there is really no right opportunity today for peace talks.
Yes.
Moreover, I cannot see that Americans would actually welcome the Chinese mediation. And given the fact that the United States is a major country in this conflict, I don't see that that could actually help much. So from the perspective of Chinese diplomacy, it was an important gesture.
Yes.
But the moment is not right today. It's not, unfortunately, we are not at the peace talk, and Americans are unlikely to accept that.
So Europe should be playing a significant role in this.
Unfortunately, you are right, but unfortunately, Europe actually doesn't play any diplomatic role in that. The only European country is Turkey, and Turkey is partly in Europe, partly in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So Turkey is a country which actually was able to show some mediation efforts, important mediation efforts, but no European country was able to do this because European countries simply actually stand behind the United States. They simply choose the sides in a manner, not only that they chose the sides, Turkey also chose the sides, but they also imposed sanctions on Russia, which went actually beyond what was necessary. So in this respect, I cannot see any European country being a credible mediator. So in this respect, Turkey can. I mean, China could be, but as I said, I see the American resistance to this.
Yes, okay, sure. The Chinese government has just adopted the law on foreign relations, its first foreign policy legislation of such a comprehensive scope. So how do you see this law?
Well,
what's your take on that?
I cannot say that I would have a sort of a profound analysis of it because time will show how the law serves, but at the first glance, I would say that it's a useful document because it helps us better understand the Chinese intention and the Chinese workings. And that's quite important because there is a lot of misunderstanding about Chinese intention.
Yeah.
So in the law, on the one hand, we see the institutional structure of the Chinese foreign policy making, the relations between different bodies. We also see the objectives of the China foreign policy, peaceful development, resistance to hegemony, which is like a signal to the United States.
Yes.
There is also several paragraphs which concern the sanctions. That China is ready to adopt sanctions in case the national security is actually jeopardized. China is already doing this. On this, actually, I would like to give a small warning because when I look at the Western experience of sanctions, the Western experience is not so good, because they do not really work as we want them to do. They are usually too blunt, so they affect many people and rarely those who should be affected. So sanctions work if they are really smart, well targeted. If the sanctions are too blunt, they actually damage not only the targets, but they also damage countries which impose them, like the European sanctions against Russia. So I understand that China will use sanctions as any country does, but I think it's good to reflect whether the sanctions that are imposed are sharp enough and they are not too blunt.
Down the road, maybe there will be the Chinese way of doing sanctions, just like you said, to be more sophisticated, to say whether it will not benefit, but just to reduce the harm and to be more targeted.
I think it seems to me really a challenge to develop sanctions with Chinese characteristics.
Good word. Having worked in both the government and also the academia, how do you perceive these two fields to be connected? in your own way?
It's actually quite difficult to connect them because they are rather independent. You know, where I see the connection is that the
But
one...
you teach diplomacy.
Yeah, one field can you prepare for the other, you know.
Yeah.
For example, you know, if you are in the academic field, you are confronted with many ideas, with the diversity of ideas. And then if you go to practice, it may be helpful because you can imagine that the world we have now has alternative and that your position has alternative. And it may develop your understanding of someone else. Because the fact that someone else does not agree with you should not be explained by the fact that he's evil. So the plurality of ideas means that, you know, you have to find compromise.
Yes.
And then, I mean, if you then come back from the practical field to the academic field, then you see that you should not take these ideas too seriously. That ideas are serious, but there are also other things than ideas. That's at least my lesson.
So you were not only the first deputy foreign minister, but also you were the ambassador from Czech to France. So did you apply any of your ideas in your practices? Can you share with us some interesting stories?
What really helped me in my being ambassador was the fact that my intellectual background opened some doors which would be closed to career diplomats. So it was quite easy for me to start a dialogue with French intellectuals and also with the most important Czech writer who lives in France. His name is Milan Kundera. I think he's also known in China because he wrote a famous book, Unbearable Lightness of Being. And his relation...
He has the whole series of books translated into Chinese, and I'm a fan too.
So his relations with Czechia actually are quite complicated, and he actually did not want to have any dialogue with any official structures. But because I was intellectual, I was able to find the way, and we actually developed a friendship. And that resulted actually in the fact that I helped to mediate a return of the Czech citizenship to Kundera. Because when he emigrated to France in the 1970s, the previous regime stripped him of his citizenship.
Why?
And because it was illegal. He illegally left country.
I see.
And after 1990s, there were actually no good conditions for him to get it back. So it was actually by my mediations that he got the Czech citizenship again. So now he has French citizenship and also the Czech citizenship.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
You did, make not only for the diplomatic world, but for the, world intellectual world.
It was a great pleasure always. I mean, it was not only the couple Kunderas, Milan Kundera and his wife Věra, but also I came into contact with many interesting French intellectuals. Among them, I would also underline someone who is also probably known in China, and that's François Julien. He's a great philosopher and a great expert on China. And he is able really to explain China in a way which is very precious for Europeans. So again, I was really happy that I could talk to him. I could actually mediate his visit to Prague, etc. So yes, these were the things which helped me in my diplomatic business.
Great. How about the other way around? Your practices, your past works and experiences, back to your academic?
It's very useful, because, before I joined the diplomacy, I used to teach the course which is called Foreign Policy Analysis. Now I teach course which is called Practice of Diplomacy. I start already teaching as ambassador, so I teach this course in Paris at Sciences Po. I teach in Pilsen, which is now my home university, and I also had the privilege to teach this course at Beijing Foreign Affairs University. So yes, I believe that I was able to enrich my teaching with my practical experience.
And then you are still very young. Will you consider serving again?
It will depend on circumstances.
Okay.
Because when I joined the government about which I knew that I can contribute with my ideas, with my effort.
Yes.
So if there are political circumstances which would correspond to what I consider right, I would consider it. But that's not on the agenda right now.
Good to know. Yeah. Always keep minds open and options open as well.